So, in this slightly different episode, we're taking a look at some of the non-novel books I've been reading. I'm not exactly reviewing them, I'm just giving a sort of brief overview of my thoughts when I read them. I did actually record this a while ago, but then there was an issue, so now I'm having to re-record it, and in between recording it then and now, I've actually read a fifth book on the subject. So it was originally going to be a quartet, but now it's a quintet. So the last book I read was this one, Sussex Folk Tales by Michael O'Leary, the storyteller, not the CEO of Ryanair or the New Zealand writer. This isn't a serious book of folklore, so hardcore enthusiasts and folklorists aren't necessarily the target audience. It tells us several stories collected from around the beautiful county of Sussex on England's south coast. Some of which feel very old, such as the Tale of King Canute in Bosom and Bevis of Arundel, some of which are more modern, like the Brighton Thing, and others which sound like the mad ramblings of random people Michael O'Leary came across, like the revenue officer who went down to Mixen Hole, a sort of Sussex version of Atlantis, and returned to land a century or so later, and now wanders around Brighton telling his story to anyone drunk enough to listen. There's also a story that O'Leary actually admits he just made up, his tale about William the Conqueror's toes, which is actually a story by John Campbell that O'Leary superimposed upon the French bastard. So yeah, this is a very fun read. It's definitely a good book for those who aren't super into folklore, but are willing to dip their toes. For serious folklorists, there is still some good stuff in here, and if nothing else, provides an interesting commentary on the nature of telling and retelling stories. Next, I'm looking at The Folklore of Guernsey by Marie de Garis. So Guernsey is one of the Channel Islands. It isn't part of the UK. It is sometimes considered part of the British Isles and is a British Crown dependency, which basically means the UK looks after them and their international relationships, but can't tell them what to do, a bit like the parent of a child in their 20s. It is also a remnant of the Duchy of Normandy, so if a Channel Island resident wants to toast the Queen, they wouldn't say, "To Her Majesty our Queen," as we would in England. Instead they would say, "The Queen our Duke," because Elizabeth II is technically the Duke of Normandy. The Channel Islands were also the only part of the British Isles to be invaded by the Nazis during World War II, and this is a very important part of their history. So any book about Guernsey is going to talk about the occupation. So Marie de Garis was born in Guernsey in 1910 and was known for composing the Dictionary of Guernesey, or Guernsey French, as well as being an authority on the island's folklore. She received an MBE in 1999 and died in 2010 at the age of 100. This book is a result of several years of research using publications from the Société Guernesey, manuscripts from a lady called Edith Carey, and from a marvellous 1903 publication called Guernsey Folklore, which unfortunately is an obscure and expensive book that regrettably I will never own. But this book is a treasure trove of stories, beliefs and customs of the folk of Guernsey. It contains nursery rhymes, ballads, songs, games, love potions, spells, curses, fairies, witches and a fair number of ghosts. One of my favourite bits was a story about a love spell called the Dumb Cake Charm, which involves a woman cooking a cake on a griddle in order to see who her future husband will be. One such girl performed this charm and a young soldier appeared to her, but unfortunately for him, it felt like a terrible nightmare. He left his sword, which the girl hid in a chest, and years later, they met, fell in love, got married. However, one day, he found his old sword in a chest, remembered the horrible night he had lost it. He confronted his wife and was so angry and bitter at the pain she had caused him, he ran her through with the sword and killed her. So that's a fun little tale. Another legend I enjoy is the fairy ancestry of the Guerns. In short, it's about how fairies from the far-off land of England descended on Guernsey, killed all but 2 men who hid in an oven, and married the women before properly leaving again. Thus, the people from Guernsey are small and dark because of their fairy ancestry, but those who are tall and fair are descended from the 2 men who hid in the oven. There are also tons of stories about ghosts. My 2 favourites are the Sow from Les Lauriers, who haunts people who aren't giving enough alms to the poor, which, you know, I appreciate. And Chico, or Bet, a large black dog seen in various places across the island. One of these places was a road called La Rue de l'Ombre de la Mort, which means the road of the shadow of death, which is metal, but unfortunately doesn't seem to exist anymore. Also, the name Chico comes from 2 languages, the Celtic Chi and Gaulish Co, both of which mean dog. So the road of the shadow of death is haunted by a ghost called Dog Dog, which is brilliant. There are two downsides to this book. Firstly, a lot of information is repeated, and also kind of in random places throughout. And secondly, the index is rubbish. So that's a bit frustrating if you're looking for something very specific. Next, we have Buddha's Crystal and Other Fairy Stories by Yae Ozaki. So Yae Ozaki was a pretty interesting lady. She was born in 1870 to an Englishwoman and a Japanese baron who divorced 11 years later. Yae moved to Japan in 1887, received an education, refused the arranged marriage her father set up for her, travelled Europe, then returned to Japan and lived in a Buddha's temple. She wrote short stories and translated Japanese fairy tales into English, which were then published in various magazines at the turn of the century. Her book, The Japanese Fairy Book, was published in 1903, followed by Buddha's Crystal in 1908, Warriors of Old Japan in 1909, and Romances of Old Japan in 1919. With her knowledge of both Japanese and English, Yae was in a unique position to translate stories in a way that kept the beauty and magic of the original Japanese tale, but was accessible for a young English audience. And a fun little extra, as she travelled a lot between Japan and Europe, many of her letters ended up being misdirected to a gentleman called Yukio Ozaki, a politician of no relation, and some of his letters were also misdirected to her. The two eventually met and actually ended up getting married and had 3 children together, including Yukiko Soma, who was also a pretty cool lady and founded the Association for Aid and Relief. So that's fun. First of all, you may notice this isn't bound in the typical Western style. There's no spine. Instead, we have these sort of thick boards sandwiching the pages, which are held in place, presumably with glue and these tassels and sort of bit of ribbon here. It's a really beautiful copy. It's a shame it's so pale because the front is really quite lovely. And then there's also a beautiful illustration inside, which I will probably put on the screen as well, which is a scene from the Buddha's Crystal, which shows the old lady retrieving the jewel from Ryu or Ryujin, the Dragon King of the Sea. I also really love the this introduction or preface, with it's got this a little correction here, which I think was really sweet, and the pages themselves are just, you can sort of feel where the words have been embossed, printed on the paper. So it's very tactile and just feels lovely to hold. So in the introduction, Yae tells us that a lot of these stories, or all of these stories, come from a gentleman called Hideo Iwaya's adaptation of old tales. Most of these stories are ones she had submitted to the magazines previously and was graciously allowed to republish them here. And 3 stories, The Demon Tile, The Fallen Comet, and Chrysanthemum Crest, were likely newly invented by Iwaya. I don't even say his name. Oops. One of my favourite stories is Isunboshi, which follows the motif of the diminutive miracle child, like Tom Thumb or Thumbelina. But here the parents are sort of terrible. They don't like their tiny son being outside because the neighbours will mock him, but they don't want him inside either because then they have to look at him. So they send him off in a little bowl for a boat to find his fortune in Kyoto, a beautiful city of clean streets, temples, and gay people, apparently. I found that line a bit too funny. I also enjoyed the titular story, The Buddha's Crystal, and the Chrysanthemum Crest, which tells how the flower came to be an important symbol in Japanese heraldry, and the imperial seal, although it's usually depicted as yellow or gold, whereas in the story it's the white one that inspires the seal, not the yellow one, so I don't know what happened there, but it's still a nice story. Next, the book I probably get the most comments on, Heath Robinson's Book of Goblins, by Heath Robinson and A.E. Johnson, though A.E. Johnson often goes unrecognised, probably because his name didn't make it into the title. Not a surprise considering I can't find any information about him whatsoever. I think it's referring to Alfred Edward Johnson, as he has his name on other fairy tale collections and collaborated with Heath Robinson on another book, but I can't tell you for sure because some of the dates don't quite add up. Heath Robinson, on the other hand, is a very well-known illustrator and cartoonist, famed for his pictures of whimsically overcomplicated machinery, which gave way to the term Heath Robinson contraption. These themes were later drawn upon by other cartoonists, including Rube Goldberg, and even made their way into the classic staple of British media, Wallace and Gromit. But Heath Robinson is also known for his illustrations, and before this book came out in 1934, he had also illustrated Hans Christian Andersen's stories and the Arabian Nights. So, On to the Goblins. The stories in this book all come from Austria and Bohemia, collected by a Professor Werner Laken, who had heard them from word of mouth and published them to complement the work of the Brothers Grimm. They were translated by Edwin Johnson, who may or may not be the Edward Johnson I mentioned earlier. I can't remember. But then there was also another Edwin Johnson who was also around at the same time, but he was more into the whole Christ myth scene, so I don't know. He is a mystery. There was another E. Johnson, actually, who I was excited about because it's a woman, but I don't think it was her, so who knows. Either way, that is where these stories come from. As a whole, they feel very similar, with motifs, characters and quirks from more well-known stories cropping up here and there, but not quite in the way you expect. It's a lovely collection and beautifully illustrated in Heath Robinson's recognisable style. I think my favourite picture is this one from The Three Princesses on page 216, because I love his face. I think it's really funny. And the second place goes to this drawing from The Nine Birds on page 135. This is also one of my favourite stories, mostly for the princess whose response to people wanting to marry her was to drop them down a Mr. Burns trapdoor and let them drown. She murders like 9 people that way. My favourite story, however, has to be Kruzmugeli, which is an Austrian variant of Rumpelstiltskin, but far superior because the king isn't a gold-obsessed creep. He's actually quite sweet. When the girl is distressed and not remembering Kruzmugeli's name, her husband is so desperate to cheer her up, he ends up throwing like fates and stuff for her to sort of try and lift her spirits. It doesn't work, but he tried, and I appreciated that. The story also ends with Kruzmugeli throwing himself through a stone wall, and all attempts to fill the hole in the wall fail. So I like to imagine the characters live the rest of their lives with this dwarf-shaped hole in the wall like a cartoon. So yeah, that's that one. And finally, onto the book I was most excited about, The Turnip Princess and Other Newly Discovered Fairy Tales. And that's why I'm so excited about this one. Newly discovered. These are the stories of the Brothers Grimm's contemporary Franz Xaver von Schönwerth, rediscovered and compiled by Erika Eichenseer and translated here by Marie Tartar. So, von Schönwerth's stories have been lost for a while. He did publish a book whilst he was alive, and he was held in high regard by the Brothers Grimm, but unfortunately fell into obscurity until the year 2009, when in the Municipal Archive of Regensburg, Eichenseer discovered a bunch of boxes filled with Schönwerth's manuscripts. In an amazing feat of dedication and organisation, she went through every single story, carefully cataloguing and categorising each one. She published a selection of these in 2010 under the title Prince Rönswiffel. I don't know how you pronounce that weird thing in the middle. I did look it up, I just forgot. In 2012, news of this discovery hit the British media, alerting famed folklorist Marie Tartar to its existence. And in 2015, this book was published. There are 2 other books of Schönwerth stories, 2018's White as Milk, Red as Blood by Shelley Tanaka, and from 2014, Bavarian Folk Stories by M. Charlotte Wolfe, which has an extra layer of interest because it's a dual language book, which isn't technically much use to me because I don't speak German, but I think it's cool. I do intend on getting my hands on those books as well because these stories are brilliant and I want more, and there doesn't seem to be much crossover with the stories included, so yeah, one day. So, as you may have guessed, these stories are from Bavaria, which is in southeast Germany, and contain some fancy castles and the city of Munich. These stories are written down as they were told to Schönwerth and his team, and have not been messed around with, unlike the Grimm's collection, which is known to have been revised a few times. These stories are a fun blend of bizarre, brutal, and sad. There are elements of slapstick, likely added in to amuse a young audience, such as a disgruntled woman mooning someone, and has an interesting mix of pagan and Christian elements, sometimes at odds, but sometimes working together for a happy solution. There are several stories which contain a sort of male counterpart to protagonists, often female. For example, men who disenchant princesses turned into frogs, and a Prince Goldilocks who hides his identity in the same way the heroines of Cinderella and Donkey Skin are forced to hide their beauty until their true identity is revealed. Another interesting thing to note is the use of the name Hans. Hans, or sometimes Hansel, seems to represent a sort of everyman, similar to Jack in English stories and nursery rhymes. Hans crops up time and time again, both in this collection and in Heath Robinson's. A few stories are named after him, such as Strong Hans and Hans Answers Riddles, but sometimes it's merely a name given to the main character, usually the youngest of 2 or 3 brothers. What I loved especially about this collection is the use of folkloric creatures, the mermaids and the dwarves and the sprites, many of which take up the role that fairies often do in British folklore. Creatures of nature, sometimes kind, but their help comes at a price. And more often than not, the price is a child. I also really appreciate the use of mermaids, which don't often turn up in many fairy tales, apart from Little Mermaid. So I enjoyed that. Another story I really liked was actually from the introduction, summarised by Tartar, like this. The story follows a man who searches in vain for the right reading glasses. Frustrated by the fact that no matter how many spectacles he tries on, all he sees on the page are black squiggles, he learns, much to his distress, that the glasses will do him no good unless he first learns how to read. Yeah, I just found that really funny. The other thing I loved about this collection is the material at the end. Firstly, we have a commentary from Tartar going into all of the stories and picking out some of the well-known motifs and how they're used differently in Schoenwerth's versions. And then we also have Ishensar's categorization of all the stories, in this book anyway, with the ATU number and where Schoenwerth first heard the story. It's the sort of thing that probably only interests people like me and is boring to most others, but I thought it was fascinating, So yeah, that's what I've been reading alongside more traditional novels. I hope you enjoyed hearing about some of these slightly more offbeat collections. I have put in the description a link to read some of Ozaki's books. I wanted to put in the others as well, but as most of them are still in copyright, I couldn't. Apart from Heath Robinson's, which I just couldn't find online, even though it is out of copyright. So if you can find it online, you can read it legally. You should be able to. But anyway, so yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time, I suppose. Ciao.